The 1980s were not just about neon lights and blockbuster fantasy. Beneath the surface, cinema descended into something raw, savage, and unfiltered. These films were not designed to comfort audiences. They were meant to provoke disgust, fear, and outrage. Governments intervened, tapes were seized, and careers were destroyed. These are the exploitation films that crossed every line and paid the price. Number 15. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. Cannibal Holocaust did not merely shock audiences. It triggered an international panic that blurred the line between fiction and crime. Director Ruggero Deodato presented the film as a recovered documentary, using handheld cameras, raw performances, and unflinching brutality. Viewers believed they were witnessing real death. That illusion was so convincing that Deodato was arrested and charged with obscenity and murder. Courts demanded proof that the actors were alive. The film follows a documentary crew who vanish in the Amazon while filming indigenous tribes. When their footage is recovered, the audience watches staged executions, sexual violence, and ritualistic cruelty unfold without relief. Animals were killed on camera, which intensified outrage and sealed the film's reputation as untouchable. In several countries, possession alone could lead to prosecution. During the video nasty panic, Cannibal Holocaust became a symbol of everything authorities feared about home media. It was banned in Italy, Britain, Australia, and several European territories. Even edited versions struggled to gain approval. What disturbed censors most was not just the gore, but the film's message. It portrayed Western journalists as predators more savage than the tribes they exploited. Number 14. The New York Ripper, 1982. The New York Ripper was Lucio Fulci's most controversial descent into urban depravity. Unlike his supernatural horrors, this film grounded its violence in realism. The killer stalks women through Manhattan, mutilating bodies with razors while taunting police through obscene phone calls. The voyeuristic tone made audiences feel complicit, which is exactly why censors reacted so harshly. Upon release, the film was banned outright in Britain and seized under obscenity laws. Authorities cited extreme sexualized violence and moral corruption. Unlike slashers that relied on suspense, this film lingered on suffering. Victims were not heroic survivors, but ordinary women punished in graphic detail. Fulci defended the film as an attack on misogyny rather than an endorsement. However, the unrelenting cruelty overwhelmed that intention. Scenes of mutilation were cut or removed entirely in many countries. Some versions circulated without endings or missing entire murder sequences. During the height of the video nasty era, the New York Ripper became contraband. Video stores were raided and distributors prosecuted. The film's reputation grew darker with each ban. Number 13. Anthropophagus, 1980. Anthropophagus, also known as the Grim Reaper, was marketed as another cannibal shocker, but became notorious for a single unforgettable scene. In it, a deranged outcast devours a fetus torn from a pregnant woman. That moment alone ensured bans across Europe and instant infamy. The film follows tourists trapped on a remote Greek island, hunted by a cannibalistic madman. Director Joe D'Amato stripped the narrative down to primal terror, isolating characters with little hope or escape. Violence was not stylized. It was blunt, prolonged, and deeply uncomfortable. British authorities banned the film outright, branding it depraved. It joined the video nasty blacklist and remained illegal for years. Even heavily cut versions struggled to pass classification. In Italy and Germany, it faced restrictions and seizures. What made Anthropophagus especially disturbing was its lack of fantasy. There were no monsters or curses, only human cruelty and hunger. The killer was not supernatural but tragically human, which made the brutality harder to dismiss. Over time, the film developed a cult following among exploitation collectors. Scholars have since framed it as a reflection of post-war European nihilism, where humanity itself becomes monstrous. Still, its most infamous scene remains controversial even today. Number 12. I Spit on Your Grave, 1980. Few exploitation films ignited outrage like I Spit on Your Grave. Upon release, it was condemned as one of the most offensive motion pictures ever produced. The film follows a young writer brutally assaulted by a group of men and later exacting methodical revenge. What separated it from similar narratives was the length, realism, and cruelty of the violence. The assault sequence stretches on with no relief, forcing audiences into a state of prolonged discomfort. Censors across the world reacted immediately. The film was banned in Britain, Germany, Norway, Ireland, and Australia. In the United States, it was protested by critics and feminist groups who labeled it dangerous exploitation masquerading as empowerment. Roger Ebert famously walked out and campaigned against its release, calling it morally bankrupt. Director Mir Zarchi defended the film as a survival story, inspired by real trauma he had witnessed. He argued the brutality was intentional, meant to provoke anger rather than titillation. However, the revenge portion did little to soften public reaction. The violence escalated into graphic humiliation and mutilation that many felt mirrored the cruelty it sought to condemn. During the video nasty era, the film became a lightning rod. Possession could result in prosecution. Video stores hid copies under counters or removed them entirely. Number 11. The Driller Killer, 1979. The Driller Killer arrived at the worst possible moment. Released just as home video exploded, it became a perfect target for moral panic. Though produced in the late 70s, its notoriety peaked in the 80s when it was branded one of the most dangerous films available on cassette. The story follows a struggling artist descending into madness and murdering homeless men with a power drill. The violence is crude, chaotic, and stripped of cinematic polish. Blood spills without music cues or narrative justification. This rawness disturbed authorities more than elaborate gore ever could. In Britain, the film was seized and banned under the Obscene Publications Act. Director Abel Ferrara was vilified in tabloids and accused of corrupting youth. The cover art alone was used as evidence of moral decay. Few critics bothered to watch the film itself. Ironically, beneath the exploitation surface lies a bleak portrait of mental illness, urban poverty, and artistic failure. The violence erupts not from pleasure, but desperation. Still, the imagery was too stark for regulators to tolerate. The Driller Killer became one of the defining video nasties. It was discussed in Parliament and blamed for social decline. Years later, when it was finally reassessed, critics acknowledged its grim honesty and cultural significance. Number 10. Tenebrae, 1982. Tenebrae shocked censors not through quantity of violence, but through precision and intent. Directed by Dario Argento, the film is sleek, clinical, and disturbingly intelligent. It follows a novelist stalked by a killer inspired by his own books, blurring fiction and reality with surgical cruelty. Upon release, several countries demanded cuts. Britain banned it entirely during the video nasty crackdown, citing extreme violence and psychological disturbance. What unsettled authorities was how composed the brutality felt. Murders unfolded with clarity and elegance rather than chaos. One infamous scene features an extended tracking shot gliding across a building before plunging into sudden violence. It was artful, yet cold, making viewers uneasy rather than thrilled. Argento was accused of glamorizing misogyny, though the film actively interrogates that accusation within its narrative. The killer's motivations are rooted in repression, obsession, and moral absolutism. Violence becomes punishment rather than spectacle. This intellectual framing confused censors who preferred simple villains. Tenebrae remained censored for years, with scenes removed or altered. When fully restored versions emerged, critics reassessed it as one of Argento's most mature works. It exposed how censorship often fails to understand subtext. Number 9. Burial Ground, 1981. Burial Ground disturbed audiences in ways few films ever have because it weaponized taboo rather than gore alone. Marketed as a zombie film, it quickly revealed something far more unsettling. The undead were only part of the horror. The real shock came from incestuous obsession, childlike sexuality, and psychological decay. The film follows a group of adults trapped in a mansion while the dead rise around them. One character appears to be a young boy obsessed with his mother. Only later do viewers realize the actor is an adult dwarf portraying a child. This revelation transforms discomfort into revulsion. The final act crosses a line that even seasoned horror fans were unprepared for. Censors reacted with confusion and disgust. Several countries banned the film outright. Others demanded cuts that removed key scenes, leaving the narrative fractured. Britain seized it during the video nasty era, labeling it obscene and morally corrupt. What made Burial Ground especially troubling was its refusal to contextualize its depravity. There was no commentary, no punishment, no moral lesson. The film simply presented dysfunction and decay as inescapable. Over time, it developed a cult reputation as one of the most disturbing Italian exploitation films ever made. Critics later described it as a nightmare of arrested development and generational rot. Number 8. Nightmares in a Damaged Brain, 1981. Nightmares in a Damaged Brain, also known as Nightmare, is one of the most relentlessly cruel slashers of its era. Directed by Romano Scavolini, the film follows a psychotic killer wandering through Florida, murdering women in graphic detail. There is no mystery, no suspense, and no relief. From its opening moments, the film establishes a nihilistic tone. Violence erupts suddenly and ends brutally. Victims are not developed characters, but targets. The camera lingers on suffering with an almost documentary detachment. Authorities reacted swiftly. The film was banned in Britain and added to the video nasty list. In the United States, it was cut extensively. Scenes of mutilation and sexualized violence were removed or altered. What disturbed censors most was the film's lack of moral framework. There is no detective, no hero, and no justice. The killer is not punished within the narrative. Violence simply exists and continues. Critics condemned it as exploitative trash. Years later, some reevaluated it as an extreme exercise in point of view, horror forcing audiences into the killer's empty headspace. That interpretation did little to rehabilitate its reputation. Number 7. Pieces, 1982. Pieces achieved infamy through excess absurdity and relentless gore. Often summarized with the phrase, "It's exactly what you think it is," the film embraced exploitation with no restraint. A campus is terrorized by a chainsaw-wielding killer dismembering victims in increasingly outrageous fashion. What made pieces controversial was its tone. The violence was extreme, yet paired with awkward humor, surreal non sequiturs, and baffling editing. This tonal chaos confused censors who could not categorize it as parody or horror. The film was banned or heavily cut in several countries, including Britain, where it became another video nasty casualty. Scenes of dismemberment and sexual violence were cited as obscene. Authorities ignored its camp qualities, focusing solely on imagery. Over time, pieces gained cult status precisely because of its excess. Horror fans celebrated its insanity and lack of restraint. Scholars later argued that its incoherence was a response to censorship itself, a film refusing to conform to any standard. Despite re-evaluation, the bans remained understandable. Pieces does not ask permission. It overwhelms assaults and mocks its own narrative logic. Number 6. Last House on the Left, 1972. Although released in the early 70s, Last House on the Left became most notorious during the 1980s when home video placed it directly into living rooms. Governments that had tolerated its limited theatrical circulation reacted strongly once the film became widely accessible. What followed was one of the most aggressive censorship campaigns of the decade. The film tells the story of two young women kidnapped, tortured, and murdered by a group of criminals. Their parents later enact savage revenge. The violence is not stylized or distant. It is intimate, chaotic, and relentlessly bleak. Long stretches are filmed with documentary realism, stripping away the safety of fiction. British authorities banned the film outright during the video nasty panic. Possession could lead to prosecution. Australia and several European countries followed with seizures and cuts. What terrified regulators was not just the violence, but the absence of catharsis. Revenge does not heal trauma, it only deepens the horror. Director Wes Craven described the film as a reaction to real-world brutality and war imagery. He wanted audiences to feel uncomfortable rather than entertained. That intent did not soften public reaction. Critics labeled it sadistic and irresponsible. During the 80s, Last House on the Left became a forbidden object passed secretly between collectors. Its reputation grew darker with each ban. Number 5. Eaten Alive, 1980. Eaten Alive is a feverish nightmare fueled by grime, madness, and rot. Directed by Tobe Hooper shortly after the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the film abandons realism for grotesque atmosphere. Set in a decaying riverside hotel, it follows a deranged proprietor who feeds guests to a pet crocodile. The film is soaked in sweat blood and artificial lighting, creating a suffocating sense of decay. Violence erupts suddenly and ends without explanation. Victims vanish beneath murky water as the crocodile lunges from darkness. There is no investigation, no rescue, and no moral order. Authorities responded harshly. Britain banned the film outright and seized copies during the video nasty era. Other countries demanded extensive cuts removing scenes of animal attack and implied torture. Censors cited persistent threat violence and sadism. What made Eaten Alive disturbing was its atmosphere rather than explicit gore. The hotel feels like a trap where humanity dissolves. Characters are cruel, insane, or helpless. There is no safe space within the narrative. Hooper described the film as an exercise in mood rather than plot. That abstraction made it difficult for regulators to justify any redeeming value. It was labeled exploitative and depraved. Number 4. Faces of Death, 1978. Faces of Death did not follow traditional narrative or cinematic rules. Instead, it presented itself as a documentary compilation of real deaths, accidents, executions, and disasters. Though released in the late 70s, its cultural impact and censorship battles peaked throughout the 1980s. Authorities across the world banned or seized the film, citing obscenity and public harm. Britain, Germany, Australia, and several other countries restricted its sale. Even possession was sometimes treated as criminal. The controversy centered on authenticity. Some footage was real. Other scenes were staged. Audiences were not told which was which. That ambiguity amplified outrage. Regulators feared desensitization and psychological damage. Unlike horror films, Faces of Death offered no metaphor or commentary. Death was presented as spectacle. The camera lingered without empathy. This absence of narrative made it impossible to contextualize or justify. Critics condemned it as exploitation at its most irresponsible. Supporters argued it forced confrontation with mortality hidden by sanitized media. That argument failed to sway authorities. Number 3. The Beyond, 1981. The Beyond is often remembered as a supernatural nightmare, but its censorship history places it firmly within banned exploitation cinema. Directed by Lucio Fulci, the film abandons logic and narrative safety in favor of relentless cruelty and cosmic despair. Violence in The Beyond is not shocking because it is sudden. It is shocking because it is inevitable. The story centers on a hotel built over one of the gateways to hell. From the opening scene, the film establishes a universe where innocence offers no protection. Characters are blinded, mutilated, dissolved, and torn apart without warning or explanation. Fulci lingers on destruction, forcing viewers to watch bodies fail in graphic detail. Censors across Europe reacted harshly. The film was banned in Britain during the video nasty era and seized repeatedly. Scenes involving acid burns, animal attacks, and eye mutilation were considered excessive even by horror standards. Several countries demanded cuts that removed entire sequences, leaving the film nearly incoherent. What terrified regulators was not just gore, but hopelessness. There is no victory, no escape, and no moral balance. The ending offers annihilation rather than resolution. Evil is not defeated, it simply consumes everything. Number 2. Angst, 1983. Angst is one of the most psychologically disturbing films ever produced and one of the most quietly banned. Based loosely on the real-life murders of Werner Kniesek, the film follows a nameless killer immediately after his release from prison. There is no backstory, no justification, and no redemption. Director Gerald Cargill traps the audience inside the killer's mind. The camera floats circles and hovers, creating a sense of disorientation. Internal monologues reveal impulses without remorse or explanation. Violence erupts suddenly and continues without cinematic relief. Several countries restricted or banned the film due to its perceived realism. Unlike stylized slashers, Angst presents murder as clumsy, panicked, and cruel. Victims beg, scream, and suffer in real time. The film refuses to cut away. Authorities feared the film functioned as a killer's handbook. The lack of moral framing disturbed regulators. There is no condemnation, no hero, and no punishment. The killer survives. Life continues. Even Austria struggled with the film's release. Television broadcasts were prohibited and theatrical runs limited. Critics debated whether the film crossed from art into dangerous obsession. Years later, Angst gained recognition as a masterpiece of psychological horror. Its influence can be seen in modern cinema, yet it remains difficult to watch. The film does not exploit violence for pleasure. It documents it with terrifying honesty. Number 1. Men Behind the Sun, 1988. Men Behind the Sun stands as one of the most disturbing films ever produced. Based on the atrocities of Japan's Unit 731, the film depicts real wartime human experimentation. Children, prisoners, and civilians are subjected to freezing vivisection and chemical testing. Director Mu Tun-fei chose realism over restraint. Many scenes were recreated using practical effects so convincing they triggered international outrage. Rumors circulated that real corpses were used. Some scenes involving children were so graphic they became instant justification for bans. The film was prohibited or heavily restricted in numerous countries. Even Hong Kong limited its release. Britain refused classification. Several scenes remain censored to this day. Unlike fictional exploitation, this film confronts documented historical horror. There is no revenge, no fantasy, and no catharsis. Victims die screaming. Perpetrators remain calm, professional, and detached. Censors struggled to justify bans without appearing to suppress historical truth. Still, the extremity of depiction proved too much. The film does not sensationalize violence. It recreates it. Over time, Men Behind the Sun became a subject of academic debate. Some argue it is essential viewing. Others claim it re-traumatizes without necessity. The film remains controversial decades later. It occupies a unique space where exploitation intersects with history. Men Behind the Sun was banned not because it was false, but because it was too real. These films were not banned by accident. They crossed moral, political, and psychological boundaries society was not prepared to confront. Some were exploitative, some were confrontational, all left scars. If this documentary pulled you into the shadows, leave a like, subscribe, and decide for yourself where cinema should draw the line.